Okay, hello and welcome to Emerald Meadows, your one-stop channel for all things RC, quilting and 3D printing. Today we're going to be talking about RC, specifically multi-rotor builds, and we're going to be reviewing a variety of flight controllers and also demonstrating their installation. Basically, I've broken this session into two areas: the basic flight controllers, which I consider the CC3D and the KK2.1 to be the basic flight controllers because they don't have altitude or position holds, so there's no magnetometer and there's no GPS devices in these, so that it can hold its position in space. So those are the basics, and the more advanced controllers we'll be looking at are the Tarot ZYX M, the P2 from Jiwi, which is JIYI, and the NAS32. All these three components have magnetometers in them, and they also have GPS connectivity that will allow you to hold position when you're flying, which is great for FPV. The other thing about these builds is that they will be they'll be broken into two parts. The first part of each of these reviews and builds will deal with the basic build of the mechanical part. I'm going to call part one mechanical, which is going to focus on making sure that the motors and the ESCs and the receivers are working properly. A lot of times when you do a build and you already have a receiver on, you build everything up and then put your receiver on the unit, such as this build here has a KK2 and everything's on it. And let's say it doesn't fly properly. Well, what's the problem? Is it the receiver? Is it where you plug something in? Is it your ESC? Is it one of your ESCs? Is it your prop? Is it one of your motors? Debugging becomes very difficult when you have everything in one assembly. So that's why part one of every view will have a basic installation. The basic installation will be of a KK2.1 or a CC3D, and that's going to be there to verify that the quadcopter is mechanically sound, so that we can place a more advanced controller on top without having to second guess if something isn't working right, where the problem is. Is it with the motors? Because we will do this in two parts, so this one here will be the Tarot ZYX M and KK2.1, because the mechanical part of this video we'll be putting a KK2.1 board on top and then testing out the mechanical build. The reason for that is that the KK2.1 has everything on board. We don't need to plug it in to a computer. We can actually set everything right up on this little screen so that we will know that it's not a software problem. We can eliminate all the problems with some of the more basic functions, because this is a basic controller, and I know that we can do all our settings right on this little screen, and I'm guaranteed that if I do everything correctly, she will fly. So that's why you're going to see two names on it. This will be the KK2.1-ZYX-M build, because the mechanical part will have a basic controller card on to make sure that it's mechanically working properly. And then part two will be putting the more advanced controller card on top to see how that is set up in order to maintain good flight. So let's get started with our build. We've got a lot to cover. And part one is, let's test the mechanical and make sure that we have a flying unit before we put on our more advanced controllers. Let's go into close-up mode. Okay, so now let's get started by taking a look at the build. You can see that my blue. Now we have to remember that this is, I'm referring to the motor that's away from me. So this is the front left motor. This is the front right. So I apologize. I have to do things to my orientation, or I get too confused. This is the rear left and the rear right. And I marked it with my blue. So a little blue dot and my white dot and my yellow and my green dot. This is how I know. This here has the Q brain in it. I like it for its simplicity. A bit confusing if you saw my previous video on how these are numbered, but it doesn't matter. This is always going to be the front left, and it's blue. Each of the controllers are going to have different labeling. This could be 3 for this. It could be marked as a number 1 for this. Who knows? They're all going to be different. So for me, this is always blue, and it refers back to the labels I go through. So the Q brain is there. As long as you have it installed properly, this part should be okay. The motors that I'm using are the multi-stars from Hobby King, and this is the 2213. I'll send you a link for it, but it is, how should I say, try to start out with getting a multi-rotor kit to start with, not the controller, but the kit. So you have your motors balanced with your props and your frame size. Now this motor will handle up to a good 450 size, and I'm now down to a 350, and this here is a 250 size frame. So I'm just trying to find that balance of power. I want to fly as long as I can, especially in FPV mode, which is something I find enjoyable. So let's get started. The whole purpose of this now is to test, is this frame mechanically good? Can I fly with it before I do anything else? And to do that, we're going to start with the KK2.1. Why the KK2.1? Is simply everything can be controlled right from the screen here. I don't need to plug it into the computer. I don't need to find out, well, okay, my drivers won't load on my computer. I can't, it won't work. Things aren't calibrating right in the computer. There's no end of problems you could run into. At least from this standpoint, from the debugging, I will know with my KK2.1 that this is in fact a good airframe. I can now set this aside saying, okay, I know this is good, now I need to focus in on my controller issues or my radio issues. So I'm going to mount this right here. The buttons on the KK2.1, that's to the back. Okay, so this will be to the back of the model, which will be towards me, and this is the screen. So I'm going to start, this is not going to be a permanent install, and I'll show you how I do a temporary install of the controller at the same time having it nice and secure. So I'm going to start with a piece of foam, and I'm going to stick that on right here. Now this is going to be my base. Take off my sticky backing and place this on my frame. Once I press it down, it ain't moving. And I'm going to use this for my other controllers as well. So I have a nice, strong foam base, and that isn't going to move anywhere. Now, when I put my controller on, I'm going to zip tie that in place. But when I do my temporary installation, I want to be able to remove it, but at the same time hold it in place as we're doing the work. And for that, I use a product called U-Glue Dashes. I think they're used by hobbyists for doing scrapbooking and other services. I find for the temporary install, it's going to hold my KK2 on sturdily, and it will allow me though to remove it by peeling it off. So I'll take off one of these, and I'm just going to place it right on the back of the KK2.1. You can see it's kind of like a little glue pad. But the great part about this glue pad is that it will peel off afterwards. So I have my glue pad on the bottom, and now I'm going to stick that onto my foam surface, and it is nice and sturdy. I can lift up the whole quad with that. Now I can twist it off and then take it off later and then peel it off both surfaces, and then the foam part is ready to go for my next install. So now that this is good, we're now going to start putting on connecting our wires. Okay, now that we have our KK2 firmly attached to our to our quad, and it's strong because we can lift up the whole quad. We're pretty comfortable in it. That one little sticker does a good job. Now what we have to do is the next step is we have to configure the KK 2.1, but before we can configure it, we got to add power to it. And the way that we get our power to our KK 2.1 in this setup is through our Q brain and the power connection, which is associated. Now on this build, we're going to assume that maybe I don't know where the motors are going, because like I said before, if you looked at the Q brain video, M1 isn't necessarily motor 1. In fact, M1 goes back here. It will represent motor 3 on this KK 2.1 build. So it's kind of a weird situation from that standpoint. So I need to have power, and on the Q brain there is one lead that has the ground, the red for power, as well as a signal wire, which is a blue one. And for those of you remembering, is I have all of mine color coded to represent the different motors, and I do it for the speed controllers, and I do it as well for the receiver and transmitter, representing the throttle. I only color code the throttle, aileron, elevator, and rudder. The rest are going to be self-defined once I get the quad more closely together. In this case here, I'm going to use the 5th channel in order to use for the auxiliary switch to go into stability mode. So the first thing we have to do is plug in our motors, and I'm going to plug it in, and it doesn't matter where you have power on this board. The power has to be on any one of these plugs. So it doesn't matter where your power lead goes in this situation. So I'm going to power it on randomly as if I don't know where it's going. But since it's color coded, I really do know where it's going, but I'm going to pretend I don't. So put it on this way. Now, the black wire is to the outside of the board on both sides. That's the ground. Make sure I mark my ground as well with a little black dot, so I always know which direction the ground is going. Again, it's just my own method of making my assemblies easy. It certainly I can go a lot more quickly now that I've color coded than I could in the old days by guessing every time. So I'm just going to put these plugs in here randomly. For now, for the next stage, I just need to have a power plug on there so that I can get power to the KK 2.1 so I can configure it. And put this plug on. Great, now I got power to the KK 2.1. Not sure which motor goes to where, but I have power. And I now take my my receiver here, and I have these color coded as well. I'm going to put these on in the order that they go in, just to make it a bit quicker. But you'll see when we configure how you can convert that to change these plugs around, so that you can test out the aileron and the different signals. So for me, the throttle goes on the 3rd, which comes from 1 till 3, and the red is the aileron. Again, the grounds are going to the edge, and the next one is the blue, which is the elevators, and the next one after that is the yaw or rudder. And I'm plugging in the channel 5. The other two I'm not going to worry about. I'll use it in the other build, so I'll just leave those plugs in there. And I'm going to put on an auxiliary plug as well. These two will be used for the Tarot build, so I'll just leave those on there. I'm just going to make sure all my plugs are in place, and they are. So now we're ready to actually add power to this board and start the configuration. Let's move on. Okay, now that we've plugged our motors in, and at this point we're not quite sure which motor is which, and we plugged in our receivers. We did that because we need to get power to this board in order to make sure everything is working properly. So we've plugged in the speed controllers, and we plugged in the radio for the throttle, aileron, elevator, rudder, and auxiliary into the left. So we've plugged in on the left the controls for the radio, and on the right the ESC. But we may have to go back and change those, but we need to get some input into this device so that we can start working with it. So that's why we plug these devices in. So let's take a look. There's only going to be about 3 settings you need to change. The rest you can leave as defaults. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the menu mode, and before we do anything with a new build, we're going down to factory reset, and we are going to reset all the settings so that we get rid of all the old models. So the old model's gone. We've totally blown away everything, and that way we're going to start with a clean slate. The next thing we have to do is we have to go in and select the quadcopter. Now we're going to go down, and we're going to go down to not that far down. We're going to go to load motor layout. So we're going to click enter, and now we're going to go down and we're going to select quadcopter X. All of my quadcopters are of type X. If you select a type that you want to stay with, this is where you're going to select it, but most people are going to start out with X mode. So make sure you select the X mode and press the enter key. Are you sure? Yes. So now take a look at your motor directions and the numbering. Motor 1 is the top left. Motor 2 is the forward right. Motor 3 is the back left, back right, and motor 4 is the back left. Look at the rotation. Motor 1 is clockwise. Sorry, motor 1 is clockwise. Motor 2 is counterclockwise. Motor 3 is clockwise. Motor 4 is counterclockwise. Make note of this because this is going to be important when we test our motors. Okay, this is all done, and we now can go back. The next thing we need to do is we need to go up. We need to go back out of here, and we need to go up. And we're now going to do receiver test. I have my receiver on, and I'm going to go into enter, and I'm going to move my sticks. Now at this point in time, okay, now I have my aileron right. See how it says right? Beautiful. Elevators, okay, forward, back, throttle, full, idle, and rudder, left, right. Now at this point in the auxiliary switch is what I use for stability mode.
Flaps up.
Is what I use to control that. If you weren't getting the right stick layout, you'd simply move the pins here on the left, and then make sure everything lines up. As I mentioned, I do everything in color mode, and my throttle is always yellow, my aileron's red, my elevator is blue, and my rudder is green. I mark them on the side of the boards. That's what you've showed you before. That's why I'm right the very first time, is because I already have it color coded and ready to go. But if it wasn't correct, I'd be unplugging and plugging. On the right, the ESCs, that's what we're going to be looking at that next, because we have to actually physically power up the motors to see what direction they're in. So now let's go back to our menu. We now know this all works. And we're now going to go down to self-level settings. Okay, no, back, you don't want to change that. you want to go to mode settings, mode settings, and you want self level to be on the stick. This is my preference, that way my auxiliary can control it. Go in there a minute and show you. So you can change it to auxiliary switch. So now I want to run off my auxiliary switch and not the stick, so I can control it right from my radio. Change, and then back. So now that's set. All the other settings, other than calibration, and we have to do the calibration when the quadcopter is flat, and we'll do that in the next step. All the other settings, Pi editor, receiver test we did, mode setting we did, stick scaling, don't change it. Miscellaneous, don't change it. Self level, the settings, don't change it. Camera stab, don't change it. Sensor test, you can do it, don't need it, but we'll have to do it after we calibrate. A calibration is what we're going to do next when it's level. CPPM, do not change it. Mixer editor, don't change it. Show motor layout, it can do, but it doesn't do anything. Load motor layout, that's what we did. Debug, we don't need it. Factory reset, we've already done it. So the reason we're using the KK 2.1 is that it's this easy to get everything going. Okay, now that we have our KK2 configured, it was quite easy, and you have to, after you do your reset, going to selecting your motor layout and doing your receiver test to make sure that your receiver is connected properly, and your mode selection, but that's an option. You don't need to do any more. You can ignore the other settings, and in fact I would highly recommend you do ignore the other settings, because I know that with the KK 2.1, with the default settings, you'll get some flight that is semi-stable, okay? There may be, things you can do in P-gain and mixer to make it do fancier things, but that's not what we're here about. We're here to make sure that we have a stable structure, and by using the defaults, you're guaranteed that you're going to have a good running system. Now, before we can do any arming, there's one final step we have to do that we didn't do in the close-up, because the quad has to be level, and the quad wasn't level. I had it tilted up so that you could see the screen more clearly. But now that if you're doing this, you now know that there's a setting in there. One more setting that needs to be done is called the ATC calibration. That is to actually set your gyros, and that needs to be based on kind of a level surface. And the level surface is, I know that this unit may not be, in fact, level right on this mount, but the calibration will make all the adjustments for it being level or out of level. You'd want the whole unit to be on a level surface, but the board can be out of level a little bit, because that's what the calibration has done. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to power on my radio and plug in the
engine on, flaps 2, high rates, gear down, level mode, surfaces unlinked, not assigned.
So now what I'm going to do is go into the KK 2.1, and I am going down to ACC calibration, and I'm going to say calibrate and continue. And it's going to go through the calibration process.
Telemetry lost.
And calibrating and continue. So the calibration is complete. Now, the arming, which is putting the two sticks down and towards the middle, we now see that the red light comes on, and now that it's armed. It will not arm until you've done your calibration. The other thing that you may want to check, and I didn't point it out when we did our close-up, is when you're in the receiver test, make sure that when you're done, that all the numbers are 0. If it's too far out of skew, it won't arm as well. So a little tip there that maybe I should have mentioned a little bit more closely is that if these are if they're not all 0 when the sticks are in the center mode, she won't arm on you, which is for safety reasons. Okay, so now that she's ready to go, we're now going to arm her. And the props are off. Always take the props off for safety reasons. And then fire up the motors. Oh,
Engine on.
turn the engine on. I always have the safety switch here. And all the motors spin up. Now what we don't know is what motors are going to be spinning up. So I'm going to unplug everything except the first one on the motor side. And I'm going to hit the motors. Remember, facing away from you, this is motor 1, 2, 3, 4, which doesn't always correspond with the ESC speed controller. So I'm going to leave the one plug in and turn the power on. Whoop. Turn the arm the unit. Oh, and motor 1 is the right motor. It's turning properly. Now I'm going to plug in the next motor, which should be this motor. And it's going. So that's good to know. That's good to know. So now this is motor 1, motor 2, that's correct. Now I'm going to plug in the next motor and I'm going to turn it on. Oh, that's not. I plugged in motor 3, but actually motor 4 started to turn. So this is plugged in the wrong place. I have to unplug that. And I'm now going to plug the other motor in and plug it in. Now motor 3 is running. So now I know that I have the right sequence. Motor 1, 2, 3, and 4 by default has to be the last one. That's going to be there. Oh, now I know I didn't have these plugs in the right sequence, but now I know I do because I've tested each motor in sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're all spinning correctly. So my radio is in good shape. My ESCs are plugged into the right channels. Now I'm going to unarm it by taking my two sticks and pulling them down and away, and that will unarm it and the red light comes off. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the props on and we're actually going to do a test to make sure we can get level flight. But now we know our motor is set and our radio is ready to go. So let's put the props on and do our test. So now that we have everything assigned, let's do a test flight. Again, we have lots of room in my work area here in order to do that. We have the propellers installed. And now we're going to test our platform to make sure that that we have a good mechanical build before we go on to the more advanced controller. So let's arm this. Let's plug in the battery. This doesn't need to be a huge flight, just to see that everything is working okay from a mechanical standpoint. And try to center this up. Hopefully this will lift off. Armed. Motors on.
Engine off. Engine on.
Okay, we now know engine's off. We now know we have a good build. It's flying actually pretty good. Like I said, this is indoors, so you don't want to do too much, but we know it hovers, and we know that all the motors are working in unison. So that is that completes the what I call the mechanical process. Although we have a flight controller on board, the flight controller is simply just to test the platform, and we'll move on to the more advanced controller. Okay, well, we've seen now the practice build. I've just removed the props. I just removed the props for safety reasons. So we've seen the test flight. We now know that this is a mechanical build, so we know it's strong. We can now move to our more advanced controller cards. We're going to now remove the KK2.1 board from this assembly and start building up the next. So I hope you see that there's some sort of method to my madness, is that I found in the past I never quite knew when I had problems when I was debugging where the problem was. Was it my props? Was it my motor? Was it my speed controller? Now I know for the rest of the build, this is a solid platform. We can move on now full bore and put on the advanced flight controller and find out how that's going to function on this platform. So I hope you enjoyed this video on the Tarot build using the KK2.1. Stay tuned for part 2, where we plan to actually do the build of the Tarot. So enjoy and stay tuned. And if you like this video, please say like, and please subscribe if you want to see more videos on these topics. So have a great day, and thanks for joining me at Emerald Meadows. Bye bye.